Good morning, everybody. My name is Kyle Shackmet from Hewitt's Digital Accessibility Services, and I want to welcome you today to our conversation about inclusive, accessible meetings. We're looking forward to a great conversation today. A couple of reminders before we get started. Closed captioning is available for this event, and you should be able to access it via the closed captioning button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will be sharing some slides and presentation materials during today's meeting, and those meeting materials are available on our website and at the bit.ly link bit.ly/inclusive-meetings. And finally, this is one of our events in partnership with many offices around Harvard as part of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is celebrated in October. And we got it in near the end, October 30th. And we're really excited to talk about ways that we can help make Harvard and the many meetings and events we conduct more inclusive and welcoming to people with disabilities. Before we get our program underway, let's meet our panelists that we're going to have a conversation with this morning. Andy?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andy Hollenhorst. I've been a consultant on the Digital Accessibility Services team since January. And before that, I was a UX researcher and an accessibility lead at Sallie Mae Bank. And I also want to point out that it was my idea to play Dolly Parton's 9 to 5 before the meeting. Just wanted to point that out before we get started.
Thanks, Andy. Eric?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Eric Manser here. I also joined Harvard in January, along with Andy and some of our other consultants. I came from IBM, where I was part of the accessibility team, and just very, happy to have landed at Harvard.
Jamie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Spear. I'm a digital accessibility consultant with the office, and I've been at the university for about 13 years, focused on public access, physical accessibility of Harvard's campus and buildings, and now digital accessibility.
Awesome. Janelle?
Hey there, I'm Janelle Sims, also a digital accessibility consultant. Previously, I was at Harvard Law School, working on the online team in the communications office. And before that, I was Harvard Kennedy School, working on communications there as well. So I've been at Harvard for a while, and it's been great to see all the different schools and departments and everybody working together for accessibility now. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Janelle. And I'm Kyle Shackmet. I lead the digital accessibility team, and I've been at Harvard for just over 5 years working on digital accessibility, from Harvard X to our disability resources office, and now within Hewitt. So thank you to all of our panelists and our captioners that are helping make this happen today. And let's get started. So to begin, we wanted to share just a little bit about our office and some of the resources that you might be able to take advantage of after today's conversation. So first of all, we offer a wide variety of trainings and events available on a regular basis for any kind of role that you may have at the university. So we offer trainings for how to consider accessibility if you are a content creator. So you may not be coding, but you're putting content on websites. If you're a developer, we have much more technical trainings. We have courses on how to test for digital accessibility. No experience necessary. We'll show you what you need to do to test and kind of see, is my website accessible? We have a course about an introduction to digital accessibility and some of the core concepts and Harvard's policies. We have a course on creating accessible documents. Whether or not we have highly technical roles, all of us probably create documents and spreadsheets and presentations. And then we have a great foundations course that's a part of our IT Academy, a great foundations, but it's open to everybody at the university. We offer office hours every 2 weeks on Fridays. So you're always able to stop by and ask our team questions if you have them. And you can always contact our team at digitalaccessibility@harvard.edu. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. We have a few slides that we want to share and some information in a presentation format, but not too long. And after that, we're going to have a bit of a conversation with our panelists, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So as we're discussing things or talking about certain information and you have a question, please submit them via the question and answer panel in the Zoom interface. And we will definitely be taking questions later on in the webinar today. We like to start every event by reminding ourselves and everybody that we work with what we mean when we talk about digital accessibility. So digital accessibility, the definition we use is making electronic content available to and usable by everybody. Full stop. We want everybody to have access to all of the awesome things that Harvard does. We especially want to think about people with disabilities in this context. And the way we say equal access is having access at the same time with the same ease of use. And that's going to come up a lot today when we talk about meetings. And of course, we're thinking about people with a wide variety of disabilities in this context. And we also think it's really important to note that digital accessibility is one of many parts of Harvard's broader efforts to think about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and make Harvard a welcoming place for people across many different dimensions of difference, disability being one of them. So I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to talk about what we can think of before meetings.
So before your event, you want to think about your platform, your invitation, and accommodations. When planning a digital event, consider the capabilities of your platform. Zoom is the most widely used web conferencing tool at Harvard, but others such as Microsoft Teams are also popular and fairly accessible. We've included some good starting points for accessibility for both Zoom and Microsoft Teams on this slide. You'll note especially that we're highlighting keyboard shortcuts, which can be helpful for navigating these programs for people using screen readers or keyboard-only navigation. A good start to an inclusive and welcoming meeting is to include an accommodation statement on your meeting invitation. We most often use the statement shown on this slide. Persons with disabilities who wish to request accommodations or who have questions about access, please contact the meeting sponsor's email in advance of the session. It serves to let your guests know that they can make requests or ask about accessibility for your event. And my favorite way to include it is to add it as a field on your RSVP form. So this way it's seamless for the requester to ask, and you as an event host can get the information sooner and start the planning process. Some common accommodation requests that you might receive and that folks have made for events in the past at Harvard are in the categories we share here of vision and hearing accommodations. So for in-person events, you may have someone request a Braille copy of the meeting materials or an assistive listening device to amplify the sound in the room. For remote events, we're currently seeing more of requests for an accessible copy of the presentation, American Sign Language interpretation, or closed captioning like we have for this meeting. There are many resources available at Harvard to help you explore and fulfill these accommodation requests. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Eric for our next section.
Thank you, Jamie. Continuing with kind of the before the event considerations, it's important that we also think inclusively with regards to things like RSVP and feedback forms and also the presentation materials. So on the slide now, there's actually a really good example of RSVP and feedback forms. You know, again, it's important that we remember that everyone needs to be able to access this, you know, functionality equally, and that includes people who may use, you know, keyboard-only navigation or people who may be using like a screen reader technology. And, you know, just as a couple examples. So the slide shows a good example where you can see things like color contrast that's being used is you know, highly contrasted and really stands out well. You can see the text against the background. Any of the required fields are marked and clearly indicate that they are required without using on color, without relying on color alone to provide that understanding. All questions are numbered, which is also a nice step in making it accessible, and that the button at the very end of the form here is clearly marked with an action name of submit, or it could use something like register. So good examples on the screen here. And then when we think about presentation materials, it's important that we make sure that all the materials that we're using in presenting are accessible themselves. Probably the #1 step we can take to do that, especially if we're using things like Word and PowerPoint and maybe Adobe Acrobat. All of those programs have a check accessibility feature built right into the tool, so you can easily kind of run it. It's essentially like running an accessibility scan where it'll flag any potential errors or potential concerns. So that's always a great step when preparing your presentation materials, to make sure that you do check the accessibility before considering the materials finalized. Always also, if you do have the ability to share your materials ahead of time, that's also a really nice step in that it allows anyone who may benefit from having an opportunity to review the materials ahead of time. It really gives kind of a more direct experience, or more direct control over an individual experience if you get to review the materials ahead of time. So whenever that's possible, that's a good practice as well. And we in the Digital Accessibility Services team also offer related trainings and customized trainings related to this on creating accessible documents. This includes things like running those automated checkers in those tools, a little more of a deeper dive. Also talks about how to use color and color contrast, things like reading order for PowerPoint slides, making sure that your reading order is logical and flows. And the basics also of accessible PDFs is another thing that we go into detail on. So would encourage you all to consider signing up for one of those trainings as well. And I'll hand it to Andy.
Great, thanks, Eric. So I'll talk a little bit about live captions. So live captions are a really great addition to an inclusive event. And as Kyle mentioned, and others as well, this event is being live captioned as we speak. I encourage you to turn on that captioning track on that closed captioning button just to experience it, even for a little bit. I tend to not turn it on when I'm speaking because it's, I'm seeing every single word I'm saying, but it's a good reminder as a speaker or event host to speak clearly and as slowly as you can. So the way that we're defining live captions as opposed to closed captioning or transcriptions or other types of captioning is that it's text that has been converted from audio dialogue, similar to other types of captioning, but it appears on the video in real time, right? So it's a live caption. More on what the source of that caption track is in a second. But as far as who live captioning benefits, it provides an inclusive meeting experience for participants who might not be able to hear what's being said. So certainly people with hearing loss will benefit very directly from live captioning, but others benefit too, including, I think we've all been on Zoom meetings in sort of a noisy environment. So to be able to see that alternate way of communication. Janelle and I did a training of a couple of months back where there was a request for live captioning, and we received a lot of really positive feedback from lots of different participants that it offered kind of that complement or that alternative way to communicate. I think Janelle will talk a little bit about that as well, but live captioning are a really great way to offer that alternative. So a little bit about automated versus professional live captioning. So live captions can be generated by like artificial intelligence or AI, or by a professional captioner, which is what we're having in this meeting, AKA a human. AI live captions can be a really great supplement to a meeting. They're available currently. We were talking about platforms. they're available currently on Microsoft Teams, and they'll soon be available in Zoom, just auto-generated live captions. We're told around January for Zoom. AI live captions aren't accurate enough yet for someone who relies on captioning as their primary method of communication. So in this case, we recommend using a professional live captioning service. Sometimes this is called CART captioning, in which a professional captioner actually attends the event, as you can see on our panelist panel, and they type what's being said for all to see. Harvard just signed an agreement with Vitek, with the company that's doing the live captioning here, that will standardize the pricing and the process for professional live captioning. So I'll talk a little bit more about Vitek and those details in a bit, but first I want to talk a little bit about the situations where you'll want to consider live captioning, either professional or AI. So when should live captioning be provided? So there are 3 common use cases. So the first is when live captioning is required or encouraged by the university. So in these cases, professional live captioning like Vitek would be the choice. So some use cases here would be university-wide events like commencement. Other large events, an example could be, there was a recent public health forum with Anthony Fauci and Sanjay Gupta. So it was a big, lot of attendees, high visibility, and also any event of any size where the live stream of the event, even if it's a Facebook Live event or a YouTube Live event, but that live stream is embedded on a Harvard site, then that would be recommended strongly or required to be captioned and be live captioned by a professional captioner. The second use case is if there's a formal request for live captioning from someone that's planning to attend. In that case, sort of similar to what I was speaking of when Janelle and I did the training, there was a request to have that the event be live captioned, again, via a professional captioner. So say, like as Jamie mentioned, someone responds to your RSVP with their request. And again, our Vitek partnership should make that much easier. And the third reason to provide live captioning is just as an inclusive practice, right? To make an event more accessible. So even when they're not required by policy or requested, you can choose to add live captions as a way of just being inclusive proactively, right? The more people that will be attending an event, the higher the chance that you'll receive a request, or it'll just be a good thing to do. In fact, we've received at least one request for this event to be live captioned. In these cases, obviously, if there's a request or if it's by policy you want to use a professional captioner, it's always a great practice. But if you're going to, if there isn't a request and you want to use AI captioning, that does certainly raise the floor for all events. And hopefully come January for Zoom, that will be an option for all events. So that's a quick intro to live captioning. And with that, I'll hand it over to Janelle for more sort of in-meeting details.
Thanks, Andy. So just want to talk a little bit about during the meeting. So while you're speaking or presenting, you want to be as clear and descriptive as possible. So orienting the conversation toward your audience. So if it's feasible, it's best to turn on your camera and face the camera. So seeing the speaker helps participants maintain attention. It can be helpful for anyone who's reading lips. And you also want to be descriptive. So make a point to describe any visual content on the page, such as images, charts, graphs. This will help anyone with a vision or cognitive disability, as well as anyone who may be joining only by phone or doesn't have their video turned on for whatever reason. And then keep in mind that expressions like right here or here we see or in the upper right corner, those don't always translate well to participants who can't see the screen. So again, just try to be as clear as possible. The illustration here shows a presenter pointing to various geometric shapes, and meeting participants are listening and watching. And then during the meeting or event, you want to try to use multiple methods of communication, and this will allow people to communicate in whatever manner works best for them. So you want to be flexible when you're taking questions. You can take advantage of the communication options in a platform like Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever platform you're using. For smaller meetings, when you're taking questions, you could allow participants to either use the raise hand feature or to post questions directly in the chat for them to be answered later. If people do put questions in the chat, you want to repeat the questions posted in case anyone who can't visually see or access the chat to make sure that they understand the question as well. The goal here is just to ensure that everyone is included in the conversation. And then just another note about the chat feature, particularly in Zoom. If you post a link in the chat, it's not always readable or clickable for people using assistive technology. So it's best to either call out or read aloud the URL. If it's really long, maybe just send it in an email or just provide that information in another way. And then one of the great things about remote meetings is there's lots of special features that you can take advantage of, such as polling and whiteboard annotation and breakout rooms. However, not all of these features are fully accessible yet. So we want to not rely on these features to convey critical information. So instead, think of them more like complementary or just adding to your content, but not relying on it completely. And when you do use the features, make sure you clearly describe any interaction, allow opportunities for participants to express difficulties or barriers they may be experiencing. On the screen here, we have an example of Microsoft Whiteboard with lots of different illustrations, charts, and graphs. So if this was being used in a meeting, all of these interactions and things on the screen would need to be described or conveyed in an alternate format. And then breakout rooms. Breakout rooms can be a great way for people to interact in a smaller group. Just make sure that before you send attendees into breakout rooms, you prepare them for the experience by announcing how long the breakout session will last and if the host will be joining any of the groups. Just make sure you provide clear instructions about how to ask a question or seek help during a breakout session. And if an attendee has requested live captioning, be sure to assign that attendee with the person who's typing the captions in the same breakout group. And then after the event, if you decide to post the video from the event on a Harvard website, just keep in mind that that does fall under the digital accessibility policy and will need to have captions that meet the accuracy level of the policy. And this means if you did provide live captions for the event, those live captions, as Andy said, don't meet the accuracy requirements. So they would need to be updated before you post the video on the website. So you can update the captions yourself for accuracy, or you could hire a vendor. But things like punctuation, speaker names, and things like that, those are just would need to be updated before posting to a Harvard website. And so with that, we're going to move on to some moderator questions. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Awesome. Thanks, Janelle. And thanks to everybody. That's some great information. As Janelle said, we want to have a little bit of a conversation now. So I have some questions for some of the panelists about things they've talked about. And while we're chatting about that, I'll invite you to continue to submit questions. We've started to have quite a few roll in. There are lots of you on today's meeting. We'll get to absolutely as many as we can in the time that we have. So Andy, one of the most popular things that our office gets questions about, I know you know this, right, is live captioning.
Yeah.
And you talked a lot about like what people should think about captioning, but brass tacks, like you worked on it for today's meeting, like what do you do? How did you like magically get the captioners in here? How do you make it happen if you're hosting a meeting and need captions?
Yeah. So I'll quickly mention the AI stuff too, right? So if your team uses Microsoft Teams, you likely already know it's just a toggle right in the platform. Zoom we don't know quite how that'll work, but I'm imagining it'll work. We'll be able to toggle it on come January, we think. So for the professional live captioning, I can sort of walk you through what I did. So I just contacted Vitek, right? So and you send them the details of the meeting, right? What the title is, what the time is, so they can schedule it. And then any sort of other information that's helpful to the captioner, right? So I think they call it a cheat sheet. I would normally call it a cheat sheet, but since I'm at Harvard, I will not call it that. I will call it a captioning guide. As far as, like speaker identification, acronyms that we all use so much, any sort of guide that can help them, with spelling and other punctuation. If you're a first timer, which I was, they'll actually do an onboarding call with you to show you how to get the captioner in the room. And in this case, where it's a webinar, so the captioner is a panelist, right, versus a regular meeting, and all those details. And then 30 minutes before the meeting, you'll send out it's like the API token. It's just a simple URL that you copy and send to Vitek, and that allows their captioning to appear essentially on screen. So and then after that, it's essentially an issue of billing right after the event. So Vitek's cost for live captioning is right around $2 a minute. They bill it's a 30-minute minimum, and they bill in 15-minute increments. So that's essentially that's it, right? That's the nuts and bolts. Pretty simple
That's
process.
cool. So all of us here, we're obviously biased, right? Like, we want to promote the use of captioning, but would it be fair to say, like, it was pretty simple, right? Like, you didn't have to know a ton of information other than where to go to ask and turning it on, right?
Yeah, and I appreciated that I had an onboarding opportunity to actually have a Zoom call. They switched the host to me so that I could see where this token was and the URL. So it was all really pretty streamlined. Nice.
Cool. Jamie, so I'm curious, so you've had a lot of experience of helping field accommodation requests for people in meetings. And sometimes that can be a little intimidating to new event hosts, saying, but what if I put this statement that you guys have said about requesting or soliciting accommodation requests, and now I'm on the hook. So, like, what can a host of a meeting kind of expect or think about when they're soliciting people to request accommodations if they need them?
Sure. So first, I would say that you're not alone in this. There's our office, Digital Accessibility Services. There's the Central University Disability Resources, and we'll both give you the same information. So we're here to help for questions if they do come up. But we talk a lot about exploring options. It's not a one size fits all for accommodation. So start with what that individual has asked for. So if it's ASL, American Sign Language, you would reach out to one of the commonly used agencies at Harvard, such as Hands in Motion or ASL Services. And then, kind of like what Andy said, you talk with the vendor and give details of your event. And for ASL in particular, they'll work to match an interpreter with that skill set. Another thing I like to mention is that some requests may become more commonplace depending on what your event is and how often you're hosting events of that type. So I worked for many years with Harvard's commencement, and one of our common requests was for an accessible version of the printed paper commencement programs. So some of these were requests for a Braille copy, others were for an accessible PDF copy. And for Braille, we typically had to work with a vendor or a specialist who could create it in Braille, but for the accessible PDFs, we could make those in-house. And having these available allowed the attendees to have access to the information in the way that worked best for them. And since this was something, we did year after year, we started just having that be our standard practice. So we would have the PDF available, we'd have Braille available at our table in the yard, and then we'd advertise that. So on our page where we talk about our event, we'd say, hey, if you need this, let us know, we've got it. And so it made it a little bit simpler as an expectation we knew would occur.
Oh, that's great. That seems to me like a great example of so many things that we encourage or teach people to do for accessibility, where the first time it might be harder or scarier or something, and but you build the right habits and it becomes just how you do it. Very cool. So I have one more question that I wanted to ask, and then we're going to take some of your questions. If that works, Janelle, we good on time?
Yeah, that's great.
So Eric, we're an IT team, and right now we're in a place where we're all doing remote meetings. We've long done remote meetings for many cases, but now we kind of all have to in many more cases. And we have like tools out the wazoo with all of our meetings, which is great and enables a lot of work. But how can event hosts think about kind of accessibility with all of the different meeting tools we use to help get our work done?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Colin. I mean, absolutely, without a doubt, like the COVID crisis and our new reality, I mean, you know, basically brought a lot of challenges for everyone on Earth, essentially. But, you know, with the sudden and abrupt move to online for everything, as you described, like that came for everyone. I mean, honestly, that presented, you know, a lot of unique challenges for people with disabilities who rely on accessible technology. And you know, with so many different tools, whether it's Zoom or, you know, WebEx or Teams, whatever it might be, you know, there are a lot of possibilities for inaccessible experiences there, right? So it's not reasonable for us to expect anyone who's hosting an event to be an accessibility expert on any given tool. But, you know, a couple of things I can say about that is that, you know, the fact that you're attending an event like this and that you're thinking about this and, you know, that you're considering the accessibility of how you're presenting, that's a major step. So that's, you know, a win already. But doing things like availing yourself to accommodations requests, like in the invite and some of the things that we're suggesting, like opening yourself up to receive that feedback from people who may have accessibility challenges. You're providing channels for that communication. So that's huge. And if you know that you're prone to using, say, Zoom over WebEx, you know, familiarizing yourself just in general with, you know, kind of the general accessibility of Zoom or what features may exist, and becoming, you know, somewhat versed in, you know, the tools that you know you yourself to use as an event host is another great step that you can take towards ensuring. So, you know, no one can be an accessibility expert on all these tools, but, you know, if you become familiar at least with the ones you anticipate using, that's a major step forward. So those are some suggestions.
Very cool. Janelle, do you want to take some questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about live captions. So I think maybe in general, when we think about budgeting for live captions, how can people think about, you know, including it in their budget, and who would be responsible for the cost? How do we think about like who should be responsible for the cost, and how do we budget for it? Anyone who wants to take that?
Jamie, do you want to talk about sort of the accommodation budget nature of that?
Excellent. It's a very common question. And I understand it's an added thing when you're working and you're planning your event. Currently, the expectation is that the event host pays for accommodations at their event, whether captioning, ASL, and to think of it similar to how you might have speaker fees or catering costs or room booking fees. And I know that we're all kind of working with tight budgets here. So as you start your planning process, maybe talk to your local financial person to get a sense of, you know, this is what we think it's going to cost. This is what we're looking to have for our event, to have it be inclusive and accessible, and get their feedback on that. Andy, could you quote those again? It was about the half-hour minimum. So
that's right. Half-hour minimum. Yeah, it's a little over $2 a minute, half-hour minimum, billed in 15-minute increments. I will mention, I was just about to type this to somebody, that Vitek does support Spanish live captioning. Languages beyond that, feel free to shoot us an email. And I think they're going to be adding stuff, but they do support Spanish.
So an hour-long event would be between $60 and $70.
Or it would be more like 120, right?
120, okay.
$2 a minute.
That's why I asked you for the math, because I was like,
right.
I know that I can't do it.
Right.
Andy, just
we have a page on our website that has price lists, and we can send that out to attendees after, right? With the
absolutely,
breakdown by service.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Andy. Can you, if you do have another like Spanish and English, can you have two live caption at the same time in both languages?
I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to go ahead and say, why don't you reach out to us so we can make sure. I'm not sure if that would require 2 captioners or what. I'm sure I don't want to ask our captioner to step out of their role and answer that question. So maybe just reach out to us and we can answer.
Great. And then Jamie, we have a question about setting up your Zoom invitation to include the accommodations request field to simplify the process for those requesting. How would one do that?
Excellent. I think that's a great idea. So thank you for bringing that up. So I think what the person is referring to is that you can require registration for some of your Zoom invitations. And you usually have to go to the browser version versus the desktop version to get that option to check require registration. But once you've done that, you can actually add a field for an accommodation statement. So it's pretty simple to do. I'm happy to share that as a resource after the fact, but it's another great way to talk with your audience beforehand and gather information. And if you're not doing something as complex as a registration, you can include it in your email. You can take your Zoom invite that you send as an Outlook invitation and include a statement there to let folks know.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. Eric, can you talk about the annotation feature in Zoom and if that's accessible?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this goes back to kind of the variety of different tools that we have access to these days, and like specifically that feature in Zoom, which is one of the advanced features, the ability to kind of annotate is, essentially providing a virtual version of that whiteboard functionality where anyone in the meeting has the option to kind of mark up whatever is being discussed, whether it's a slide deck or photographic images or what have you. And the importance with that is that for many non-visual attendees, someone who may be totally blind or someone with low vision may have difficulty appreciating or understanding what's being marked up on the screen. And so the importance becomes being sure to be descriptive, as we kind of alluded to earlier, just making sure that you're sufficiently describing out at the same time as you're, doing that markup or drawing on the screen, essentially. Just being mindful to also kind of speak out loud as you do it is a great way to kind of provide that that same information to the non-visual members of the audience.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we're getting so many more questions. I'm trying to sort through. Let's see. Maybe Andy, can you just talk a little bit more about the process from providing live captions for a live event and then the pre-recorded, the post-production captions?
Yeah.
Why we need to use 2 different vendors and just that kind of process?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you can, when you record an event like we're doing right now, right? And you might have seen that when you record to the cloud, you can see the transcript of what you've of what's been read out. So you can if your event has been live captioned, you can actually grab the and edit the closed caption track to that, and you can edit that yourself. But often a better option to do a professional job is to take essentially, it's your Zoom meeting, it's your file, and you can send it out to a third party. So like we have a preferred relationship with Replay Media, and the current rate per minute to do that post-production captioning is $1.65. So it's a pretty affordable thing to turn around, and then you have a recorded professional track that you can then post on a site or somewhere else. So you have a couple options there.
And one thing I want to mention, because I saw it in the questions, is we're mentioning all these vendors, and you might be wondering, where do I find this after the meeting?
Yeah.
So the vendors are listed on our website as well as the Disability Resources website, and we will share links after the fact, but they're pretty prominently located.
Great, Eric, we have another question about the polling feature in Zoom. Do you want to kind of mention just that, and in general more tools and maybe your experience with using some tools in Zoom?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was interesting early on, kind of in the lockdown, when everyone was suddenly online for everything. I had, you know, I happen to be someone who identifies as having a disability myself. I have, you know, low vision, so, you know, considerably diminished vision. And so, you know, I rely on, you know, assistive technology like the ability to magnify what's on my screen and invert my colors. And when we all kind of moved abruptly to using Zoom so regularly, like, you know, I actually was curious to, within my network of, you know, others that I know who have, you know, vision loss and blindness, like, you know, to find out what of these advanced features of Zoom, you know, worked well and may not work so well. And, you know, one thing we found specifically with that polling feature was that there was a little bit of inconsistency. Like many of my screen reader friends, you know, might be alerted that, you know, the poll was launched, and then might have difficulty, you know, identifying exactly where the questions began and that sort of thing. So, you know, again, it's kind of another example where, you know, if you're going to be using these advanced features in some of these platforms like Zoom, it's great if you can be very explicit that you are using them, you know, share that, you know, you are launching the poll now. Just be very descriptive, and also provide options for your attendees to, you know, share in chat or just speak up or whatever, to say if they might be having difficulty. Like if any of the features are presenting barriers, it's good to open yourself to know that immediately in the moment. You know, it's funny, I had an experience just this week, actually just 2 days ago, honestly, like where I had attended a meetup online, and it was ironically a diversity meetup. And you know, they were using a tool that I hadn't even heard of called Remo. And, you know, not to criticize Remo, but like, you know, it was a tool that I was unfamiliar with. I'm someone who, you know, nothing on my screen looks, you know, generally like it looks on most people's screens. So, you know, I'm hearing the descriptions of how the tool functions and having difficulty kind of syncing that up with how I'm, you know, what I'm looking at on the screen. And, you know, it got to a point where, you know, they were prompting me to turn on my mic and turn on my my camera, and I couldn't find how to do that. And all of a sudden we were going to break out to these virtual tables where you're going to go and introduce yourself at your virtual table, and I couldn't figure out how to do that. So like literally my only choice was to parachute out, as I say. Like you know, like when it got to be like 30 seconds before we were going to break out into these groups, I had no choice but to drop because, you know, it was just too much. You know, too much functionality I wasn't familiar with yet. And so I kind of had to abandon this diversity meetup, which was unfortunate, but, you know, it's also sometimes what happens. But, you know, again, it's important, you know, again, as we can, to be explicit and communicative, to make sure that we're being accessible in how we're presenting. Long-winded answer, I know, but.
No, that's a great example, Eric. I mean, an unfortunate experience, right? But a great example of how these kind of tools have real world implications, right? So I know that's why one of the things, right, we try to encourage people to do is if you're using Zoom or something for a wider meeting, right, like send the keyboard shortcuts or as many upfront things you can do to make it an easier experience for someone who might be new. We might all, at least internally, wish we were less familiar with Zoom than we are now. I've certainly experienced some of that myself using assistive technology, right, being blind and trying to attend meetings where it's one thing to attend a meeting or to get into a meeting, and then it's a different one to be able to interact or do everything in the meeting. We have a lot of the different platforms many offices use that can crowdsource agenda items and upvote and rank things, which is all like really awesome technology, right, and great. But when we use platforms that do that aren't accessible, then it's kind of like, well, I didn't get to submit agenda items. I didn't get to rank anything, right? So then it becomes, do I voluntarily leave a meeting like you did in that one? Or what if it's important that someone representing accessibility be at a meeting, right? And how are we thinking about those ways that's where our work really intersects with the broader work of inclusion and belonging, and not just as buzzwords, but like actually living up to what we're trying to do. So, yeah.
Well, it was interesting too, Kyle, because in that experience the other day, like, because it was a diversity meetup, and like they made statements to the effect of, like the tool, like Remo had been tested by screen reader users. And so, they made it clear that they had considered accessibility, but, just I think the newness of the tool in my experience, and like, the color contrasts weren't great. So, that's another thing, sometimes, we focus on just one aspect of accessibility without kind of considering the broader accessibility for all, all potential needs. So
yeah, the accessibility sort of is being invited to the party, and then the real inclusion is being sort of asked to dance. I
exactly.
think that like that, and that's what we've, as a team, we've encountered, specifically to the polling question, right, where we were deciding in one of our trainings, like how will we do that? Will we use poll everywhere, or the Zoom polling? And we were just like, well, what do we need all the percentages for? Let's just have people write what their choice is in the chat, and then we can go through, and that can be we essentially put it in as a conversation starter. So that worked the best, and it was the most kind of low tech way as well. I mean, not everything is going to be that easy, but
I can't tell you how much of a relief it is to hear like a host that says like, either speak up or use the chat, or like they give you multiple options. I mean, it may be more work for you as a host, but it's so comforting, like for someone who, may struggle to identify where the chat is. If I can just unmute and speak up like that, that gives me the option to, you're not automatically blocked out, which is a nice thing,
Right.
Awesome, thanks. Jamie, we have a question about options in live captioning. Like, is there an option to have the speaker name in the captions, and is it always uppercase?
Excellent. So live captions, they're done on the fly at a pretty fast speed. So it's more common to have speaker name if you have like post-production captioning, because everything is happening so fast. And that's actually also the same reason that you have the all caps, because the person doing the captioning needs to get it in and accurate as soon as possible. So stopping to consider spelling around like the name mark ending with a C, or a mark on a wall, like making a differentiation like that could result in other content being totally lost. So it is the standard to have it in all caps, even if it might feel a little like the captions are shouting at you.
Yeah, and I'll add for post-production captioning, one of the nice things that 3Play Media has, once something's captioned, you can go in and they have the editor, and they have a bunch of settings, right? Like how speaker identification should work. You can go back in and you can, they'll flag things where things are inaudible, or they might have, been unsure of a spelling, to be able to go in and add that via a settings platform.
And I would say that's something like I sometimes look at the videos we get back as an office, and Eric's name being E-R-I-C-H, I've occasionally had to go in and fix that from what someone might have heard the spelling of Eric to be. And this is one of the reasons why we do say those live captions do have to be cleaned up to be accurate for post-production quality. Right. So it's those little differences like speaker identification and maybe something that was misheard that is going to be fixed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're never going to require 100%. Nothing can be 100% right. Like some things will always be inaudible to a captioner during the event, or a captioner after the fact to a subject matter expert. So it's really the kind of once over of looking at the caption track and just making sure everything looks okay, and nothing is an oopsie like misspelling that might be embarrassing, for instance. Just a once over check.
And 3Play makes it really easy, as Andy said, flagging areas for you to check. You can also, when you upload a video, include some key language. So if there are specialized words you're using, you can just kind of throw that in as the vocabulary to make it easier from the get-go.
Exactly.
And then we have two questions that are kind of similar, both about how do we, we may know about being inclusive and presenting in an inclusive way, but how do we encourage other people who maybe are outside of Harvard or other faculty? How can we encourage other people to be descriptive and inclusive without it being too overwhelming? If anyone wants to take those.
Sure, I can. So being descriptive or talking, right? I have very rarely, if ever, encountered someone in the many years working in accessibility at Harvard and elsewhere where people hear about a concern, or a consideration for accessibility, making something easier for people in general and say, I don't care, I don't want to do that, right? So I do think an important first step is for us who are either championing accessibility in spaces that we work and interact, whether or not it's our job, right, is just speaking up and being an ally and asking about accessibility. The best time to do that is in advance, though. It is flustering if someone was not prepared to describe things and halfway through a lecture being told suddenly, in addition to trying to keep track of everything that you're saying, now start describing things. But it's much easier if when you are hosting a speaker, giving them guidelines of expectations. I expect, guest lecturer, that you will give us your presentation slides in advance so we can have them as an accessibility aid if someone needs. Or we expect you to describe images if you have. It doesn't mean you need to go in great detail, right? But if you're showing the trend line of, you know, the job growth or deficit figures over the past 18 months, right? You could easily give some highlights of where there were increases or decreases, or if they were sharp or gentle slopes that could, in a couple of sentences, give a really accurate description. You don't need to lay out every single data point, right? So being general, try to keep it conversational. Imagine you're describing it to your roommate or your partner or the person in the next cubicle if you were in the office, right? In just a couple of sentences, and then giving speakers or presenters kind of expectations in advance of what they can do, or a couple of ways that can be helpful. And then just not being afraid to ask about it.
Yeah, I'll add the, oh, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was just going to add some thoughts on the descriptive aspect of that. Like, I agree entirely with exactly what Kyle said. I'll also suggest to you that, you know, there's also a possibility. Like, I have had an experience in the past where, you know, if I were on a call with 50 people and I was one of 50 people on the call, you know, and the host or the presenter knew that, you know, I'm attending as someone who is visually impaired, you know, it can be awkward, especially, you know, depending on the personality. If the, you know, the person is an introvert or shy or whatever, you know, it can become awkward if the presenter is specifically, even though it's well-intended and totally appreciated, you know, if they're like, oh, and Eric here, you know, like of 50 people, like they're singling me out and kind of calling, like visually out what's on the screen and stuff, that can be a little tricky as well. So, you know, again, to Kyle's point about, you know, being subtle, being nuanced, being descriptive, and just conversational about it, I think is important. And I'm sorry, Andy, you were going to.
No, yeah, exactly what I was going to say. We all have to be better at being descriptive in the Zoom online world. I was just facilitating my first grader the teacher was showing them how to toggle out of Zoom to go to another educational tool, and like she had to figure out how to, you know, she didn't know what his screen size was or whether he was on a Chromebook or on a whatever. She has to figure all that out and then describe in a very first grader patient way, right? Or first grade teacher patient way of how to do things. And like, that's whether we acknowledge it or not, we're all kind of figuring out that way to not be able to just point and show someone, because we don't know what, you know, the experiences on the other side necessarily. Right. It's an important thing, I mean, for all of us to get better at, myself included.
Yeah.
Sure. Janelle, maybe time for one more question or so.
We have so many questions. So I will say we are going to send a follow-up email to everybody who attended today. And there are a lot of questions just kind of about the policy and captioning and things like that. So we'll provide links to our website, you know, anything, any kind of resources, you know, like that. But, you know, as Kyle mentioned before, if we didn't get to your question, feel free to email us at digitalaccessibility@harvard.edu, and we'll be happy to get back to you. But we really appreciate all these great questions that are coming in. So we just for one final thing, as we think about going on our way, what, if any of these tools, should we keep in our toolbox for when we're all back together for in-person meetings? Jamie, you want to maybe kick that one off?
Sure. So one thing I always think of for in-person meetings is the physical accessibility of the space. I know that wasn't quite the question, but Harvard's a big campus and there are some older buildings. So you want to think about accessible entrances as well as the pathway to the event space and the accessible bathrooms. Make sure the building has them. But tools to keep in mind, think when you're going back to in-person meetings about what you're sharing and how you're sharing it. So if it's primarily a meeting where you're talking, make sure that you're considering hearing needs. So it might be if people are requesting, as I said, an interpreter, or if there's any kind of amplification for sound in the room using a microphone, assistive listening devices. It's the same kind of rules apply of using an accommodation statement so that someone who's attending can let you know what their questions might be. But if you're teaching at the front of a class or talking to participants and you do have visuals, it would be the same as describing them in the Zoom setting. So mindfully being descriptive without giving every detail.
And I
Any other,
can add,
yeah.
like, just to add to that, like, I, for one, would totally be on board with the idea of, even when we're back in person and in physical classrooms, like, I would still love to have the option to, even though I'm in the same room with you, like, still attend that via Zoom, or like, just because, like, for someone who struggles visually or whatever, like, looking at the overhead projector and the slides, that are presented at the front of the room, is a little more challenging than being able to kind of directly control my experience by having the slides or the Zoom version of the slides, inverted and, and like magnified on the screen right in front of me. So like, I've realized a lot of benefits. So I would still love to have Zoom options even when we're back in person,
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, that's great. I think we're learning many things in many dimensions where, digital accessibility is one example where now everything's digital. It's even more important, right? But it'll hopefully we'll develop some of these practices that we can continue to use even when we're able to be in person more often. I'd like to wrap up now, just first of all by thanking our panelists, Janelle, Jamie, Eric, Andy. Thanks to our captioners for helping make this event happen today. As a reminder, we mentioned all those trainings. We have trainings about our policies, about different ways we can make content accessible. One of the things that our team does is if you can get 10 to 20 people together from your department or your office, we'll run a custom session of any of the trainings that we offer. We have our office hours you can come check us out in. And another thing that frequently we get asked to do and are happy is if you have 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes at a staff meeting or an all hands meeting or a department meeting, and you want us to come chat about some kind of accessibility, maybe meetings or captioning, we're happy to do so. So we're here to help everybody at Harvard kind of learn how and make their stuff more accessible. So once again, we'll be following up after the meeting. You're always welcome to check out our website, accessibility.huit.harvard.edu. And we'll look forward to seeing you in an upcoming event. Thanks again for joining.